You were told that America first was an ironclad oath. You were promised an end to the forever wars, an end to the shadowy regime changes, and finally, the full, unvarnished truth about the Epstein files that have haunted the halls of power for decades. But tonight that promise didn't just bend, it shattered. While the headlines scream about a heroic intervention in Venezuela, a much darker reality is unfolding behind the closed doors of the Department of Justice. 3.2 million documents, evidence that could link the highest levels of power to the world's most notorious predator, have just vanished into thin air. Is the Trump administration actually cleaning the swamp, or are they just building a bigger, more dangerous one in the jungles of South America? Tonight we peel back the layers of a classic Wag the Dog maneuver that might just be the fatal error that tears the MAGA movement apart from the inside out. Let's look at the facts. Just days ago, news broke of a Delta Team operation in Venezuela. The narrative fed to the public was simple, taking out 30 Cuban mercenaries guarding Maduro. But look closer at the timing. Why now? Why, when the administration's economic pillars are trembling under the weight of tariff backlash and dismal polling, do we suddenly find ourselves back in the business of kidnapping foreign leaders? In a recent New York Times interview, the president himself hinted that this wasn't just a quick strike. It's an occupation with no exit strategy in sight. This is where the first fatal error occurs. For 10 years, the core of the MAGA movement was built on a rejection of the neoconservative war machine. By invading Venezuela, the administration has walked straight into the same trap that consumed the Bush and Obama eras. It's a violation of the America First principle that is already causing a civil war among the base. This isn't about democracy in Caracas. This is about oil, and more importantly, it's about what's happening in a federal court in New York. While you were distracted by the jungle warfare, the Trump DOJ was busy performing a disappearing act that would make Houdini jealous. Under the Epstein Transparency Act, they were legally mandated to release millions of pages of evidence. 2 weeks ago, Todd Blanche, the number 2 at the DOJ, officially cited a denominator of 5.2 million documents. He claimed 400 people were working round the clock to ensure transparency. Fast forward to this week. In a quiet letter to Judge Angel Mir, that number didn't go up, it plummeted. Suddenly, they are only talking about 2 million documents. Where did the other 3.2 million files go? Did 32 million pages of evidence suddenly become irrelevant in 7 days? It is mathematically impossible to review, redact, and dismiss 3.2 million documents in a week. This is the shock admission mentioned in our title. By changing the numbers without a single footnote or explanation, the DOJ isn't just hiding files, they are insulting the intelligence of every American citizen. They are counting on the Venezuelan war to keep you from asking, who are they protecting? And why is the America First DOJ acting like a shield for the very elites they promised to take down? If you think a war in the jungle is chaotic, wait until you see the forensic accounting of a cover-up. While the world was watching soldiers in Venezuela, a digital execution was happening in a federal database in New York. We are talking about the missing 3.2 million documents, a mountain of evidence that the Trump Department of Justice effectively wiped from the public record in less than 7 days. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a mathematical impossibility that the government just admitted to in a quiet, unassuming letter to a federal judge. How does a legal team review 32 million pages of the most sensitive evidence in American history during a holiday week? The answer is simple: they don't. They just make them disappear and hope you're too distracted by the sound of gunfire to notice the silence of the truth. To understand the magnitude of this fatal error, we have to look at the numbers. Under the Epstein Transparency Act, the DOJ was forced into a corner. They had to provide a denominator, a total count of the evidence they held. Just days ago, Todd Blanche, the man Trump handpicked to help run the Department of Justice, stood before the public and gave a very specific number: 5.2 million documents. He didn't say, around 5 million. He said 5.2. He promised that 400 federal employees were working around the clock, redacting names and preparing the files for release. It was a performance of transparency designed to quiet the growing storm of public outrage. But then the mask slipped. In a follow-up letter to Judge Angel Mir, who is supervising the production of these files, the DOJ's narrative didn't just change, it imploded. Without a single footnote, without a hint of explanation, the number was suddenly revised down to 2 million documents. In the span of 1 week, 3.2 million documents, roughly 60% of the entire Epstein archive, simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the law. Think about the scale of that. If the average document is 10 pages long, that is 32 million pages of testimony, flight logs, bank records, and communications that have been moved behind a veil of secrecy. The Department of Justice is counting on the public to be mathematically illiterate. They want you to believe that in 7 days, they determined that over 3 million files were not relevant or were duplicates. But any legal professional will tell you that such a review would take months, if not years, even with 1,000 people working on it. This is the moment the America First promise of transparency meets the brick wall of institutional protection. By making these files vanish while the president talks about liberating Venezuela, the administration has handed its critics the ultimate weapon, proof that the swamp isn't being drained, it's being reconfigured to hide the very secrets that could bring the entire system down. This is the betrayal that MAGA supporters never saw coming, a DOJ that shapeshifts its own data to protect the status quo. The most dangerous element of this geopolitical theater isn't the capture of Nicolás Maduro. It's the potential for a sweetheart deal that could fundamentally rewrite American history. Within the halls of the newly formed Weaponization Committee of the Department of Justice, led by figures like Ed Martin and overseen by Attorney General Pam Bondi, a disturbing narrative is beginning to take shape. Public interest groups and independent analysts are sounding the alarm. The Trump administration may be preparing to offer Maduro a way out of a 50-year prison sentence in exchange for a confession that would validate the most debunked conspiracy theories of the 2020 election. To understand the stakes, we have to revisit the fevered imagination of the 2020 post-election legal battles. The claim, championed by individuals like Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani, was that Venezuelan software, endorsed by the late Hugo Chavez, was used by companies like Dominion and Smartmatic to flip millions of votes from Trump to Biden. It was a claim that faced the ultimate stress test in the American legal system. Over 90 lawsuits were filed in federal and state courts across the country. Forensic auditors hired by Republicans, cybersecurity units within the federal government, and even judges appointed by Trump himself all reached the same conclusion. There was no evidence of such interference. The claims were dismissed as baseless, yet they remain the animating principle behind this latest move in Venezuela. Why would Maduro agree to such a lie? The incentive is overwhelming. Maduro is currently facing narco-terrorism charges in the Southern District of New York that could keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. For a dictator who has spent decades clinging to power through corruption, a sweetheart deal that grants him a silent exile with his wealth intact is the ultimate lifeline. For the Trump administration, the benefit is twofold. They secure control over Venezuela's vast oil reserves, the largest in the world, and they finally get a confession to support the claim that the 2020 election was stolen. This is the fatal error that threatens the very foundation of the rule of law. If the Department of Justice uses a foreign dictator's coerced testimony to overturn years of judicial precedents and forensic findings, it signals the end of objective truth in government. It transforms the DOJ from a neutral arbiter of justice into a tool for political retribution and historical revisionism. While the public is told this operation is about freedom for Venezuela, the evidence suggests it may actually be about fixing a domestic narrative that the courts have already rejected. It is a gamble that risks shattering the credibility of American institutions on the global stage, all for the sake of a deal that prioritizes political survival over factual integrity. But the Department of Justice's Digital Disappearing Act is only half of the story. To find the other half, you have to look at the physical locations that have been at the heart of this legal storm since the very beginning. While the government claims it is struggling to process millions of pages in federal servers, a much more direct question is being asked by legal analysts and survivors' advocates. What happened to the evidence that never made it into a government database? We are talking about the personal hoard of documents, the laptops, and the private communications that have remained shielded from public view, often tucked away in the private residences of the president himself. The irony is thick enough to choke on. For years, the Mar-a-Lago document case was dismissed by supporters as a politically motivated witch hunt. We saw the photos of boxes stacked in ballrooms and bathrooms, spilling over with classified secrets. But as the Epstein Transparency Act hits a brick wall, those boxes take on a new, more sinister meaning. According to legal experts following the FOIA lawsuits, there is a massive gap in the DOJ's search parameters. Have they searched Donald Trump's personal accounts? Have they mirrored his personal phone or the laptops that were present at Mar-a-Lago during the time the FBI conducted its initial raids? The record shows that while the FBI grabbed what they could, they didn't grab everything. There is a hoard of materials that remains in private hands, materials that potentially contain the most direct link between the president and Jeffrey Epstein. Enter Skye Perryman and the team at Democracy Forward. They have launched a first-of-its-kind lawsuit to force the hand of the administration. This isn't just a request for more Epstein files. It is a surgical strike aimed at the communications between Trump and Epstein himself. And here is the bombshell twist that has the legal world buzzing. This FOIA case is being heard by Judge Tanya Chutkan, the same judge who presided over the January 6th cases. The intersection of the January 6th insurrection, the Mar-a-Lago document hoard, and the Epstein cover-up is no longer a fringe theory. It is a consolidated legal reality. The administration is now fighting a multi-front war on transparency. On one side, they are slow-rolling the release of documents they admit they have. On the other, they are stonewalling requests for the personal communications they claim don't exist or are protected by privilege. This creates a black hole in the narrative. If the DOJ is truly committed to the America First principle of cleaning out the corruption of the elite, why are they using the same procedural tricks and shape-shifting tactics to protect the personal records of the man at the top? By refusing to account for the physical evidence at Mar-a-Lago while losing 3 million digital files at the DOJ, the administration is making a fatal error in judgment. They are banking on the idea that the public will keep falling for the distraction of foreign wars, while the most important evidence in the history of American corruption remains under lock and key in a private club in Florida. We need to talk about the linchpin. In any administration, there is one policy, one central pillar upon which everything else rests. For this administration, that linchpin is the tariff. It was marketed as the ultimate tool of economic sovereignty, a way to force the world to play by America's rules. But as we stand here today, that linchpin isn't just loose, it is failing. And when the linchpin fails, the entire carriage of the American economy begins to wobble. The error here is a classic overestimation of leverage. The administration assumed that by slapping massive tariffs on steel and aluminum, reaching up to 50% in some sectors, they would force allies like Canada to bow to Washington's will. Instead, they've triggered a domino effect of industrial volatility. In Canada, we are seeing the immediate fallout: steel plant layoffs, halted pipelines, and a diplomatic freeze that is costing billions in potential trade. But the real fatal error isn't just the economic loss, it's the growing disconnect between the policy and the people it was supposed to protect. Look at the manufacturing belts in the American Midwest. These workers were told that tariffs would be their shield. Instead, they are finding that the cost of raw materials is skyrocketing, making American-made goods increasingly expensive to produce and even harder to sell on the global stage. It is a paradox of power. In trying to secure absolute economic sovereignty, the administration has isolated the United States from its most vital trading partners. This isn't just an economic debate, it's a strategic crisis. This brings us back to the sudden urgency in Venezuela. Why is the oil deal with Maduro so critical right now? Because the tariff strategy has left the administration desperate for an external win to offset domestic failures. They need a massive influx of energy resources to counteract the rising inflation and supply chain disruptions caused by their own trade wars. They are essentially trading the long-term stability of the Western alliance for a short-term injection of Venezuelan oil. It is a high-stakes gamble that ignores a basic reality of modern geopolitics. You cannot maintain global leadership if you treat your closest neighbors like adversaries. The sovereignty that was promised is starting to look like isolation, and for the working class caught in the crossfire, the dream of an industrial renaissance is being replaced by the reality of a global trade war with no clear exit strategy. We have arrived at what legal scholars call the constitutional stress test. In a healthy republic, the Constitution acts as a cage, limiting the reach of the executive to ensure that no single person, no matter how popular or powerful, can act above the law. But as the lines between the Department of Justice, the military, and the president's personal political agenda continue to blur, that cage is beginning to rattle. The fatal error being made right now isn't just a policy mistake. It's a systemic challenge to the separation of powers that has defined America for nearly 2.5 centuries. When the system is pushed to its absolute limit, We find out whether the guardrails are made of iron or merely paper. Consider the role of the Department of Justice in the proposed Maduro deal. When you have a political committee, spearheaded by figures like Ed Martin and overseen by the highest legal officers in the land, suggesting that the DOJ should negotiate a confession from a foreign dictator to validate domestic political grievances, you are witnessing the death of the DOJ as an independent institution. This is executive overreach in its purest form. Under the traditional American system, the Department of Justice is meant to be a blind arbiter of law. When it becomes a tool for rewriting election history or securing oil contracts through coerced testimony, the constitutional limit has been breached. The MAGA movement promised to end the weaponization of government, yet the current trajectory suggests a new, even more potent form of institutional manipulation. Furthermore, the unilateral use of the Delta team in Venezuela raises profound questions about the War Powers Act and the role of Congress. If an administration can engage in combat operations and potential regime change without the advice and consent of the legislative branch, the checks and balances designed by the founders are effectively neutralized. This isn't just about whether you support the intervention or hate the Maduro regime. It's about whether you believe any president should have the power of a king. The movement was built on a promise of restoring sovereignty to the people, but the actions we are seeing, the bypassing of the legislature and the opaque nature of foreign military maneuvers, suggest a pivot toward a centralized executive authority that is the very opposite of what the founders intended. Judge Tanya Chutkan and other members of the federal judiciary remain the final line of defense in this stress test. As they preside over cases involving the Mar-a-Lago documents and the Epstein files, they are not just deciding on specific evidence. They are deciding whether the Constitution still has the power to compel the executive branch to tell the truth. The fatal error here is the belief that the system can be bent indefinitely without breaking. If the rule of law is sacrificed for political convenience, the principles that shatter won't just be political slogans. They will be the foundational pillars of the United States itself. We are watching a constitutional thriller play out in real time, and the ending will determine the fate of the Republic for generations to come. The most dangerous consequence of this administration's fatal error isn't found in a trade deficit or a foreign skirmish. It is found in the death of public trust. For years, the rallying cry of the movement was to drain the swamp, a promise to expose the rot within the elite and restore power to the forgotten men and women of America. But when the Department of Justice, the very institution tasked with that cleanup, begins to play shell games with the Epstein files, the movement's moral high ground begins to crumble. We are witnessing a crisis of the elites where the preservation of institutional secrets is being prioritized over the cries for justice. This is the moment where the rhetoric of anti-establishment meets the reality of self-protection, and the resulting friction is creating a fire that may consume the administration's remaining credibility. Let's talk about the human cost of this mathematical manipulation. Behind every one of the 3.2 million documents that vanished from the DOJ's count is a potential lead, a piece of testimony, or a record of a survivor's trauma. For decades, these individuals were told that the system was rigged against them. They were promised that a new kind of leadership would finally shine a light into the darkest corners of Jeffrey Epstein's network. Instead, they are watching the DOJ shapeshift its data in real time, effectively telling the survivors that their pain is a variable that can be adjusted for political convenience. This is the ultimate betrayal of the base. You cannot claim to be a champion of the people while simultaneously shielding the names and records that the people have been demanding for years. It creates a vacuum of trust that no amount of Venezuelan oil can fill. The psychological impact of this gaslighting is profound. When a government tells you one week that there are 5 million documents, and the next week tells you there are only 2 million, without offering a single explanation, they are banking on your exhaustion. They are hoping that the constant barrage of shocking news from the Venezuelan border or the latest tariff announcement will make you too tired to care about the missing math. But trust is not a renewable resource. Once the public realizes that the transparency they were promised is just another layer of the same old cover-up, the connection between the leader and the movement is severed. The fatal error here is the belief that political theater can indefinitely replace factual integrity. Furthermore, this erosion of trust extends to the very idea of American exceptionalism. If the United States Department of Justice can disappear millions of documents with the stroke of a pen while engaging in Wag the Dog military maneuvers, how can we differentiate ourselves from the rogue regimes we claim to be liberating? The loss of trust isn't just a domestic problem, it is a global strategic liability. As the MAGA principles of transparency and anti-corruption shatter under the weight of these DOJ admissions, the administration loses its ability to lead by example. We are left with a system that looks less like a beacon of hope and more like a fortress of secrets, leaving the public to wonder, if the swamp isn't being drained, who exactly is being protected in the deep end? We have reached the moment of truth. When you strip away the jungle camouflage from Venezuela, the complex legal jargon from the Department of Justice, and the chaotic noise of the tariff wars, you are left with a single, undeniable conclusion. The fatal error isn't a single policy. It is a fundamental betrayal of the very principles that built the movement. The promise was to return power to you, the people. But the reality we are witnessing is the consolidation of power to protect a few, while the evidence of elite corruption, those 3.2 million Epstein documents, is systematically erased from history. We are not just watching a political administration struggle. We are watching the structural integrity of the American Republic being tested like never before. The verdict is clear. You cannot claim to fight the deep state while using the Department of Justice to hide the files that could expose its most depraved secrets. You cannot claim America first while embarking on foreign adventures that mirror the regime change failures of the past 30 years. And you certainly cannot claim to be the champion of the working class while using trade policies as a blunt instrument that isolates our economy and risks the livelihoods of those who believed in the dream of industrial sovereignty. By prioritizing short-term political theater over the long-term health of our institutions, the administration has created a vacuum. In that vacuum, trust dies, and the rule of law becomes nothing more than a suggestion for those in power. So where do we go from here? The path forward doesn't belong to the politicians or the bureaucrats who shape-shift the numbers to suit their narrative. It belongs to you. It belongs to the citizens who refuse to be gaslit, who demand to know where those 3.2 million documents went, and who hold every official, no matter their party, to the standard of the Constitution. The era of blind faith in political saviors must end. The only way to truly drain the swamp is to keep the lights on, to support independent journalism that isn't afraid to dive into the footnotes of a DOJ letter, and to demand that justice for the survivors of Epstein isn't traded for a barrel of Venezuelan oil or a coerced confession. This is the final warning. If we allow the precedents being set today, the disappearance of evidence, the weaponization of foreign policy, and the erosion of the separation of powers to become the new normal, then the republic we know will cease to exist. But if we stand firm, if we stay informed, and if we refuse to be distracted by the wag the dog maneuvers of the weak, we can still demand a return to accountability. The truth is still out there, hidden in the redactions and the missing files. Our job is to make sure it is never forgotten. Thank you for staying with us through this deep dive. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and never stop asking the questions that the establishment is too afraid to answer. This is the intersection of law and politics, and the fight for the soul of the system has only just begun.